interesting conversation going to take place today among our panelists. Some of them are old friends. Some of them will be new friends, hopefully, after today. And we're going to introduce them in just a moment. Our topic today is not something we Christians often know a lot about, and it has to do with Jesus in the Talmud, Jesus in the rabbinic literature, the early rabbinic literature. And by that we mean, the few centuries beyond the beginning of early Christianity primarily. But we're going to be talking with some experts who know that material, who know those languages well, and they're going to enlighten us about those days and those times and those insights that we can find from reading those and understanding those texts. Let me introduce these folks one at a time, and if you would, we'll give them applause when they come up. We'll start with Dr. Bruce Chilton. Dr. Chilton, if you would come, please welcome him today. Right.
I think I'm here,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, you're right there. Thank you. I got confused there for a second. Dr. Chilton teaches at Bard College, where he is the Bernard Iddings Professor of Religion there. He's also the founder and director of the Institute of Advanced Theology, and is a graduate of St. John's College, Cambridge University, where he did his PhD. His hobbies include squash, which I take to be the sport and not the vegetable.
Not the drink. Yeah.
No, okay. Yes. And birds and French culture and detective fiction and dirigibles. I want to learn about dirigibles.
There's a lot to be said, and if I start, my wife will never forgive me.
Okay, well, we want your wife to be happy with what we do here today. Author of a number of books. His most recent book is entitled Resurrection Logic, How Jesus' First Followers Believed God Raised Him from the Dead, by Baylor University Press, 2019. We'll be talking about that tomorrow in a podcast, we hope. But it's a great new book. We have about 30 books here that he has either written, authored, co-authored, or edited. And so he is a prolific author. We are so grateful, Dr. Chilton, for you being here today. Can we call you Bruce during this time?
Please do.
Please do. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Welcome him one more time, please. Michael Vowell, please come and join us. Have a seat right up there.
Thank you.
His better half is here, right? Your wife is here.
That's right.
Beautiful. It says here, beautiful, smart, and spirited bride.
Yes, I have a date tonight.
You have a date tonight?
Yes,
Oh, you're
yes,
smart.
very
Oh, good.
smart. Getting ahead of the game.
Lauren Vowell. They have 3 kids. And Michael is the founding rabbi of Beth El Shalom in Sugar Land, Texas. Live in Richmond, Texas, I think I heard you say earlier. Has a master's of theology in the Hebrew Bible, Semitic languages from the Dallas Theological Seminary. And we are grateful for him being here and bringing your lovely wife with you. And I hope you have a great day tonight. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Very good. All right. Dr. Evans, if you will come and join us. Please welcome him today. Dr. Craig Evans is the, please sit right there. John Bisagno Chair of what's the title?
Christian Beginnings.
Christian Beginnings, Christian's Origins, Christian Beginnings, School of Christian Thought at Houston Baptist University. Did his PhD at Claremont Graduate University. Taught for 21 years, which is when I first kind of became aware of him and his work. In Vancouver, Trinity Western University, 21 years. And then more recently in Canada, on the other side, in the maritime regions, in the Acadia Divinity School in Nova Scotia. He was there for 13 years. Came to HBU in 2016.
That's great.
2016. Author of, I think, 600 articles and about 70 books altogether, many of which are here. If they're not, they ought to be. And he's going to help fill in our ignorance on that and help us understand which books we need. But anyway, thank you, Craig, for being here today and being a part. Joseph Shulam, please come and join us. Please welcome him today. He's come a long way. He's come a long way. He's a Hebrew scholar, a Christian minister at a Jerusalem congregation, synagogue there. Got his education at the Hebrew University and Lipscomb University in Nashville. And he leads this Messianic Jewish congregation known as Nativia. Is that correct? Did I say that correctly?
No, the ministry is called Nativia. The congregation is called Roy Israel, which means Shepherd of Israel.
Shepherd of Israel. Very good. Okay, thank you so much. He's lectured here before. He's lectured extensively around the country and around the world, and has just come to us from a long, long long journey. Now, because of the nature of the material today, because a lot of us don't have an orientation, we've asked a couple of our guests to kind of just begin with some introductory remarks. So we normally begin with Mark posing difficult questions. That's going to be my job today, or actually fun questions, we hope. But before we do that, we're going to ask Dr. Shulam to give us kind of a few opening thoughts about Jesus and the Talmud, Jesus and these opening few centuries of Jewish and rabbinic texts, and then that'll be followed by a brief presentation as well from Dr. Chilton, and then we'll engage in our conversation together. Dr. Shulam, thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and it's my pleasure to be back here in the Lanier Theological Library and in these lectures. I'm happy to see my son, my daughter-in-law, my best friends, and from Dallas, who are also members of the Nativia USA board members, and I'm glad to see old friends like Charles and others here. I debated a lot and prayed a lot about what I want to present in these lectures this weekend. I could have talked from the Law of Moses, from the prophets, from the wisdom literature, from the New Testament, but I chose something that I know that is kind of outside the box of the Christian world, and that is just a touch, just a drop of what the attitude of the Jewish rabbis was in relationship to Jesus and his disciples in the early 1st and 2nd century. Why is this important? Because any story that you have without substantiation, without outside proof, what is it? It's a myth. If you don't have some kind of evidential anchor to base your story, your ideas, from outside witnesses, then it's not necessarily true. Truth is something that can be examined, and we are commanded to examine it by the New Testament twice. The most clear place is first letter of the Thessalonians, Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 5, verse 20-21, in which it says, test everything. Don't be fools, don't accept, don't believe things that you haven't tested, that you haven't proved, that you don't have any clue whether it's true or false. You know, most of the religions of the world are false. Yeah? They have zero historical, geographical, archaeological witnesses outside of their own mythological frameworks. The Bible, Judaism, and because of Judaism also the disciples of Yeshua have plenty of outside documentation, outside proof that make it beyond reasonable doubt that what we are reading in the Bible, Old and New Testament, is substantiated. Now, the problem is that in the Christian world, because of the history of Christianity, post-Constantinian Christianity, there was a great chasm driven between the Old Testament and the New Testament, between the Jewish world and what is called the Christian world, that actually nobody in the New Testament was a Christian. Paul never said, I'm a Christian. He said 5 times, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israelite, I'm even a Pharisee. But he never said, I'm a Christian. Neither did Peter, neither did John, neither did Andrew or Timothy or any of the other main characters of the New Testament. They all substantiated their faith as a Jewish faith. Christianity is a 4th century invention, essentially, after Constantine. Before that, there was no such thing as a church building. So, I believe with all my heart that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah, the Son of God, divine, equal to God. And I want to make sure that when I teach this to my fellow Jews, I have some Jewish witnesses of what the New Testament witnesses about Jesus. So that's why I chose this topic. And tomorrow I'm, by the inspiration of Mark and a good friend of mine, Scott Sager. Scott, are you here? Not yet.
Be
He's
here
on his
tomorrow.
way.
Here tomorrow.
He'll be here tomorrow. So they limited my scope to 3 witnesses of great rabbis, world famous, some of the most famous rabbis of their day that became disciple of Jesus, which Christians don't know because they don't, the churches taught the people, all the churches, not one, that when they come to church, put your brain in neutral and coast. Even grease the road in front of you. Don't ask too many questions. Give money, shut up, and go home. Or to the cafeteria on Sunday at noon. So that's what has happened. And my task here is to be a Jew. And Jews are troublemakers. They cause people to think. And that's what I hope will happen to you tomorrow. And today I'll deal with my Jewish and my Christian brothers and sisters here on the panel. That's the introduction.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you for giving us an overview of the forest and of the overgrowths and thickets which have sometimes prevented us from being able to perceive that, because in every phase that we're dealing with in the New Testament, we are certainly dealing with religious ideas which are brought about on the ground of Judaism, such that if one doesn't understand Judaism, one doesn't understand the New Testament. It really is as simple as that. But that makes for a very complicated challenge. One reason for the complication simply has to do with the dates of the sources that we're dealing with. So, for example, today's topic, Jesus in Talmud. Talmud does not refer to all rabbinic literature in all time. It doesn't refer to Jewish sources which are contemporaneous with the New Testament. Doesn't refer to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Doesn't refer to the earliest parts of the Mishnah. Doesn't refer to the earliest translations into Aramaic of the Hebrew Bible, which are known as Targumim. We'll look at one Targum source later on. These are all examples of literature whose Aramaic happens to be closer to that of the New Testament in time. But in my opinion, it is very important for all historians to get over what I would call a chronological fundamentalism. If I work in the field of the New Testament today, right now, and I'm dealing, let's say, with the study of the Eucharist, it is, which Anglicans, of course, call the Lord's Supper. I'm trying to learn these things. If you're studying the origins of the Lord's Supper, it is expected that you will read a Greco-Roman work called the Deipnosophists from the 4th century of the Common Era, because it gives you Hellenistic mealtime customs. But of course, it's from several centuries later. Guess what? It comes from approximately the same century from which the Talmud began to be compiled. So there are times when later sources will inform you of earlier materials. And there is an even, in my opinion, more important factor, and that is that however you read it, the New Testament lies on a continuum between the Hebrew Bible on the one hand and the Dead Sea Scrolls, through its own period of development, and then into the development of rabbinic literature. Knowing where any given text lies along a continuum always enables you better to understand it. All the more so when we're dealing with a type of tradition in Judaism, which I would like to focus on, which is known as Haggadah. Great deal of attention has been developed in recent years to the issue of midrash, that is, interpretation. But Haggadah refers to the act not of interpreting, but of telling or retelling. The term is most frequently encountered in the proper Passover Haggadah, but that is only one telling. A Haggadah can be any statement which has to do with declaration rather than ethical teaching. It might be a narrative, a parable, a story, an aphorism, or an image. So I would like to deal with just two cases, and they're on the handout, and at one point I think we'll find the image reinforced by one that we can see at a larger size. Two cases in which we can see that the gospel according to Matthew in particular, which is the favorite gospel of the Talmud, that is the one which is most frequently referred to, how the gospel according to Matthew lies on a continuum of Haggadah. Now, in saying this, I'm not saying that these tellings directly influenced Matthew, and I'm not saying that Matthew directly influenced these tellings. There has been a certain tendency in scholarship to make that assumption, and we have learned to dispense with it. Rather, our focus is on the comparative treatment of a common Haggadic understanding. So I take as my first example the presentation of Jesus' crucifixion in a tractate of the Talmud called Sanhedrin, the chief court, in which Jesus is presented as someone who is a mesith, that is, a deceptive prophet. Now, the punishment for that kind of prophecy is stoning. And so in that particular Haggadah, Jesus is in fact stoned to death. And at the instance of the court, not at the instance of the Roman prefect. In addition to that, the whole action takes place not in Jerusalem, but rather in Tiberias, even with the involvement of Pontius Pilate. Clearly, in this Haggadah, which is manifestly late compared to the New Testament, the overall assessment of Jesus as being someone who has misled Israel has governed the presentation as a whole. But it's rooted in the claim that Jesus is a mesith, a deceptive prophet, a practitioner of deceit, which is exactly an accusation leveled against him in the Gospel according to Matthew, and also in Justin's dialogue with Trypho. Now, as you might imagine, when such stories circulated in the Talmud in the Middle Ages, they ran into a problem with censors. And so some of them have, in fact, been excised from Talmud. And then they've been reassembled in a kind of literature called the Toldot Yesu, the generations of Jesus. Notice that's named after the Gospel according to Matthew, which begins, "These are the generations of Jesus." And this collection was no doubt subject to expansion. So within the Toldot Yesu, we have not only an account of Jesus' death, but also of the claim that he was resurrected. And that's the first entry on your handout, those of you that can see it. The statement is made, "It was I who took the fatherless from the grave because I feared his disciples would steal him away." Where do we have that fear expressed prior to this Haggadah, the Gospel according to Matthew, and only Matthew. But then look at the next statement as well. I've hidden him in my garden and let a channel over the place. Now, this particular reading of the Toldot Jesu is clearly medieval. Luckily, there is an Aramaic fragment of it that was found in Cairo, where we have the more specific statement that the body was put in the Rahita da Maya de Beginta da Rabbi Yehuda Ganana. The body was put in the channel of water in the garden of Rabbi Judah, the gardener. It's always troubled me that it's particularly a channel, and I'd like to explore why that is the case within the story. First, of course, at this stage, this particular Haggadah is reflecting John, not just Matthew, because it's in John that we have the burial in a garden and also the encounter of Mary Magdalene with the gardener. So there's an exact symmetry between the Aramaic statements here in the Toldot Jesu and in what we have in the Gospel according to John. We also know that this is in fact a motif earlier than the Talmud that has been developed. How do we know that? From a statement of Tertullian during the 2nd century. Tertullian refers to accusations by detractors that, quote, the gardener removed him lest his lettuces be damaged by the crowd of visitors. So in both cases, in this particular Haggadah, the action is protective. Either you're protecting the lettuce or you are protecting the integrity of the tomb site. But in both cases, the issue arises, why should it be the case that we're talking about the channel and the water? This is where we come to, those of you who can see it on your handout, a panel, oh, and there it is, from Dura Europus, which comes, we know, from the middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era. We know that because the rulers at that time who were opposed to the Romans, the Sassanids, did us the favor of destroying the place in 256 and therefore sealing it up. So we actually can know that this existed in the 3rd century at Dura in a synagogue. And what it shows us is that actually the Haggadah has been considering threads a needle. It has to be able to argue that anything that happened in regard to Jesus did not prove that he had been raised from the dead, but it also had to acknowledge and indeed celebrate the resurrection of the dead itself. Because if we were in Dura, imagine that the wonderful paintings that we have to look up to see were right next to us, and that right there was a 25-foot mural depicting the prophecy of Ezekiel, all concerning the resurrection of the dead at eye level, all the way through the process of worship. Think of that mural every time someone says to you, Judaism does not assert the resurrection of the dead, Christianity does. The fact is that there is a passionate dedication to this idea within the mural. All 3 figures that you see on the left side of the mural are Ezekiel, and there's more Ezekiel, as it were, off camera as you move along. But you can see also that although this is typically called the Valley of Dry Bones, they're not dry. They are coming together. They're being infleshed. But there's something else which is going on, and that is in that mountain split in 2. Where do mountains get split in 2? in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, where the Mount of Olives is split in two, and God stands astride it, 1 foot on one side of the split, the other foot on the other side of the split, and that's so that his holy ones can come with him. Again, recall the gospel according to Matthew. At the time of the crucifixion there, and only there, there's an earthquake, and many bodies of the saints, we typically say. Who are these saints? They are the holy ones. The holy ones referred to in the book of Zechariah. This panel shows us that Ezekiel, Valley of Dry Bones, chapter 37, and Zechariah, chapter 14, are being read together, down to the fact that we have an olive tree on each side of the split, 2 olive trees in Zechariah, and that on each of those peaks there is the hand of God taking the place of God's feet, because in this particular mural, when God intervenes, it is pictorial by means of a hand. So the Dura synagogue painting shows us something which is also present in the next entry you can see on the handout page. This actually comes from a Targum, that is an Aramaic paraphrase of the Song of Songs. And here it is inserted, Solomon the prophet said, "When the dead come to life, the Mount of Olives will be split asunder, and the dead of Israel will come out from beneath it. And also the righteous who died in exile will come by way of channels under the ground, and will issue from under the Mount of Olives." And this picture of the concentration on Zion split apart is something that is repeated at various stages in rabbinic literature. You notice that underneath the right-hand peak, there are bodies lying down. They are in the channels. So our Haggadah in the Toldot Yesu is a masterpiece of apologetics. Another example of this I can deal with more briefly to keep to my agreement with David. And that has to do not with Jesus' resurrection, but with his birth. Some of you, I think, may well have heard of one of the few things one frequently does about Talmud, namely that it claims that the biological father of Jesus was a Roman soldier. How do we get there? I'd like to discuss how that is the case. First of all, it begins, and you have the first entry on page 2, from actually a passage of the Mishnah. The Mishnah comes from the 2nd century of the Common Era. It is earlier than Talmud. And it deals with the particular problem of that person known as a mamzer, that is, someone whose paternity has not been established. According to the book of Deuteronomy, such a person has to be expelled from the congregation even until the 10th generation. So it's important to specify who exactly a mamzer is among the various castes of Israel. And so the Mishnah sets up a thought experiment. She, that is a young woman, is pregnant. And they say to her, "What kind of fetus is this? That is, where did this baby come from?" "From a certain man, and he is a priest." That would be a good answer, because it would deal then with the problem of caste. Rabbi Gamaliel and Rabbi Eliezer say she's believed. Rabbi Joshua says we do not rely on her statement, but she remains in the assumption of having become pregnant by an Etain, a slave, or by another mamzer, until she brings evidence for her words. That is, cases of doubt can lead, not in all cases, but they can lead to the finding that a person is in the status of what's called mamzerut, unestablished lineage through Israel. Still an Israelite, but unestablished lineage. But this definition changed over time. It changed to the point that instead, by the time you get to the period of the Talmud, you have to show that the paternity is from someone who is not appropriate to the union. So, in Kiddushin 70a, that is from Talmud, when a Gentile or a slave has sexual relations with an Israelite woman, the offspring is a mamzer. It's no longer doubt that causes the assignment, it's knowledge. To some extent, this reflects the awful circumstances of the great Second Roman War against Judea and its rebels during the 2nd century, when there was deportation and rape on a massive scale. This contributes to the current position where Israelite descent is understood through the woman. In the biblical assumption, it is through the man. So then, our Haggadah in Talmud gives us a repetition of something already as early as the time of Celsus in the 2nd century, against whom Origen wrote a refutation, namely the claim that Jesus' father was a Roman officer. So in the form that we have it in the Talmud, the last entry is Shabbat 104b. Why was he, Jesus, called Ben Stada and not the son of Pandera? You could get this, Pandera, Pantera. Said Rabbi Hista, the husband was Stada, the lover was Pandera. But was not the husband Pappus ben Jehuda, and rather his mother Stada? His mother was Miriam, the woman who let women's hair grow long. This is as they say about her in Pumbedita, a town in Babylonia. This one strayed from her husband. This is a masterstroke, because Jesus is then a mamzer for 2 reasons. One, it's an adulterous relation, and the other, it's a Roman soldier. But what it all derives from is the understanding explicitly stated in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 18, that Mary and Joseph were not living together at the time the pregnancy was announced. They were just in that position at the very beginning in the Mishnah. So what we can see in these cases is not, as it were, historical fact jumping out from us, but rather the continuum of a Haggadah. And we can see the telling being shaped over time in differing communities. Thank you, David,
Very
for
good.
this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That gives us a sense of what some of these texts at least are talking about. Dr. Evans, if you go over here to the library, you see these Dead Sea Scrolls, you see these facsimile of Dead Sea Scrolls. Jews were a very bookish people. They did a lot of writing. Could you help us situate the New Testament within all of, sort of, not necessarily all, but a lot of that literature? What's being written when we say Talmud, when we say Mishnah, when we say pseudepigrapha, when we say Dead Sea Scrolls? Because there's a lot of literature there that we're trying to wrap our minds around.
Well, that is a difficult question. It's a complicated question because the Bible's more of a library, and it spans hundreds of years, Tanakh. And where the boundary, the canonical boundary, was in antiquity wasn't really known. It wasn't thought about that much. It's later, a lot of Christians are surprised to learn that the church has already been around a couple hundred years before the rabbis themselves settled on what exactly makes up Tanakh, Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the Hebrew Bible. So there's an overlap. And of course, Christians were asking themselves the same question: what is our authoritative literature? Now, the rabbis say, well, what is it that defiles the hands? In other words, what sacred scroll that you hold means you have to do something to get your state of purity where it's supposed to be. That's an interesting way of talking about it. And so they might say, well, does Sirach defile the hands or not? Christians would say things like this: what should be read in the congregation when the church gathers, what should be read publicly. And they make some interesting distinctions. One writing that was very popular, the Shepherd of Hermas, it's okay to read it, but just not in the church. You know, those kinds of distinctions. And so we actually see this. We're not guessing. You hear comments made by church fathers to that effect, and we actually have some old codices that would have canon lists at the back, and they would make comments like that. So you get into their head and you see what they're doing. Well, there's a variety of writings that emerged what we today call the intertestamental period of time. Of course, it's a bit anachronistic. Nobody was saying that then, but we say that now. It's convenient. And so there were writings that might have been included in Tanakh, but weren't. And writings that were included in Tanakh that didn't get written until the intertestamental time, or at least finished, and that's another complexity. Something might be really old, but it gets edited and updated, and so some parts of it aren't as old. And then there are writings that make no claim whatsoever to be Scripture, but they're interpretations of Scripture or catalogs of halakot, the way you should interpret Scripture. Or now, thanks to 4Q MMT, that is the halakhic letters, 6 copies of which we have, and now we can restore almost the entire thing. We have a better idea of what Paul was talking about when he said works of the law. Because this particular writing from Qumran, that's pre-Paul, talks about works of the law that you ought to do, and you should not mix your grain with the grain of Gentiles. And you realize, isn't that something? Paul gets angry at Peter because he stopped eating food with Gentiles, and he calls it works of the law. Is that just a coincidence? Probably not. And so these intertestamental writings, as we like to call them, many of them, most of them, I don't think ever envisioned themselves as being read as Scripture and authoritative. Nonetheless, they bear witness, as Bruce was saying, to the ongoing development of interpretation, halakhic and Haggadic interpretation, how to understand Scripture and important scriptural teachings. And so these writings represent that. And the pseudepigrapha that we talk about, hundreds of years span of pseudepigrapha. Some of the oldest pseudepigrapha reach right back into the period of Tanakh. And some of the Old Testament related pseudepigrapha would reach, in moving forward, into the time of the New Testament in the early church. That's quite a range. And the Christian writings, same thing. You get into the 2nd century, you get into the 3rd century, and there were some who felt that, the New Testament writings hadn't said enough. We need to hear more. And so we have an apocalypse of Peter. The apocalypse of John in the New Testament isn't enough. In fact, we have an apocalypse of John, which is not the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And everybody gets into the Acts. Seems like all the apostles have a revelation of one sort or another. And books of Acts galore, some new epistles as well, and 36 Gospels. Some of the better known ones, of course, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary, and so on. So this is the range of literature that we have. So some of it is Scripture or Scripture-like, some of it's commentary like Pesharim or Midrash, and some of it is revelatory, some of it is legendary, extending the information we wish we knew from Moses or from other Old Testament worthies like Elijah and Solomon and David and others. And so we get this rich library spanning probably 1,500 years, depending on where you want to cut it off, and it's all very helpful. And one of the challenges I've had as a professor teaching in this area, students will say, well, why do I want to read that? It isn't inspired, or it isn't in the canon. It has no authority. Well, that may be so, but you want to read it and become acquainted with it so that you can understand better that which is accepted as authoritative, so that you understand better what Jesus and his apostles are talking about, or characters talking about these things in older times in the Old Testament. So this is the literature that we deal with. I find it really fun because thanks to the ongoing publication of papyri, do you realize we have an estimation of about 400,000 pages of Greek text not yet published. Most of that from Oxyrhynchus, one place. I was in the Griffith Papyri lab a few years back in the Sackler in Oxford, And I asked that question, I asked a papyrologist, when do you think you guys will be finished? They go, oh, he says, maybe 300 years.
If we're lucky.
Yeah, really?
If we're lucky.
Yeah, so there you are. That's what we're dealing with. It's fun, it's challenging, but it's very rewarding.
Rabbi Vowell, earlier, Rabbi Shulam said that Christianity as we know it is a kind of a 4th century phenomenon. How do you see it? You agree? Disagree?
You know, it's one of those great questions that's very inflammatory. To a large degree, I would say, no, I disagree. I think the movements, the streams, and the trends that form 4th century Christianity had their movement right out of Acts 15. And you see a clear movement out as Rabbi Paul, that's how I like to refer to him, goes out into Asia Minor, and as he's interacting, I think, with Gentiles and trying to contextualize what this is going to be and what this is going to look like. You know, whether or not any of the early 1st century Jewish followers of Messiah called themselves Christians, maybe not. I mean, you can't nail down, no, they did not. But I asked the question differently. Would they be ashamed to be called it if we're talking about, say, Christians in 100 AD who were standing for the Messiah and giving their lives? It was a pretty honorable name. So I tend to look at it just a little bit differently. I do think there were some things that developed that historically did drive a wedge between the Jewish section of the body of the Messiah. A famous painting that's in one of the churches was the Church of the Circumcision, and then the Church of the Uncircumcised. And you begin to see this, you're over here and we're over here, rather than being a body that's knit together, Jews and Gentiles, and having a mutual beneficial influence on one another.
Take us, I mean, we're talking about a big body of literature, the Talmud,
Yes.
right? I mean, think of the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? I mean, it's huge. It's a ton of material. And it comes together over a long period of time, right? So there's a process by which those books are written, composed, commented upon, and it's not distilled down into a single collection. Aren't there 2 Talmuds, Rabbi Shulam? And how are they being read today, let's say in your congregation in Jerusalem? Are they being read today?
Well, first of all, in our congregation, we don't read the Talmud. We only read the law, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, and the New Testament. That's what we do in our congregation. However, the Talmud is a conglomerate of about 400 years of material, starting from the 1st century, from the time of even the 1st century BC, and continuing all the way to the 5th century. But there is embedded in it even more ancient material. They're called outside, or braitas. They're called outside material that is brought in to the discussion by the different rabbis. So there's some very, very important ancient, more ancient even than the New Testament and even than some of the intertestamental literature. My purpose was not to get into these kind of things like Dr. Chilton got into. I wanted to, but my good friend Scott Sager advised me to be simple and to be more inspirational and not get into this kind of medieval stuff like Toldot Yeshu and things that were mentioned by Dr. Chilton. It's a dangerous material. The Talmud and the Rabbinical literature, when I was studying in a Rabbinical college for 4 years, the rabbi warned us himself, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. He said, the Talmud is like the ocean. It's got good fish and it's got bad and poisonous fish and dangerous fish. So you have to know, what you're getting into. So my idea for this lesson was totally different. Was to show you how close and how important it is for us to look at the Talmudic texts that deal with Yeshua, deal with Jesus, and to learn from them. Why is that important? Because the minute that you have your enemies, some of these rabbis were enemies of the gospel and enemies of Yeshua. When you have your enemies talk about you and discuss about your birth and about your death and about your message, that is a proof that you exist. It's a proof that you're real. The fact that the Talmud is talking about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus is only helping me as a Jew, as a Jewish disciple of Yeshua, to know that this is not a myth. This is real. That the rabbis are discussing how he was crucified, when he was crucified, on the eve of the Passover. That's the text that he was referring to in Sanhedrin 43b. It's out of the desire to be against him. They prove that he is. And they prove that he was killed by a Sanhedrin decision. They prove that he was killed on the eve of Passover. They prove that there is rumors of his resurrection. They're not interested to preach the gospel. They're interested to disprove the gospel. But if Mark was here as a lawyer, he would tell you that if your enemy, if your opposition confesses at least a part of your witness, it makes your witness more valid, more true.
Correct. Very good.
And so that is what I really wanted to get into. Yeah. But the British are the British. What can we do with them?
So, you alluded to this a moment ago. I'm not sure what to do with that exactly. Just leave it alone. Just don't go there at all. Both of you, a couple of you talked about the fact that a document like the Talmud has later material and earlier material. The Mishnah, earlier material, later material. How do we distinguish between what's early and late?
Hebrew. If it's in Hebrew, it's early.
If it's
in
Hebrew,
Aramaic, it's later.
Okay. But we have an Aramaic specialist here and the Targumim specialist. How do you see it? Is that alone enough to be able to make that determination?
It depends on the Aramaic, because there are dialects of Aramaic, and this has been an area that has attracted a great deal of research over the past generation. We now have what we never had before, what is called the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon, which anyone could look up by means of Rabbi Google and discover not only the meaning of Aramaic terms, but in their terms in different dialects and also in different periods. And one of those important periods to do with the Talmud, that is the Babylonian Talmud, which is the dominant one, is that it reflects developments in the Babylonia of the Sassanids, the ruling government of that time, which helps us better to understand why this to and fro is going on. Why is it that we see a rising tide of rabbinic concern about Christianity, and at the same time, Christian writers in the same place are writing increasingly an entire literature known as against the Jews? This is happening then. This is, I think, one of the key developments of the 4th century, which becomes unlike previous centuries. Namely, that Christianity doesn't simply include Gentiles, it actually comes to assert Gentiles are superior. And that those, unlike the teaching of Paul, especially in his letter to the Romans, they claim that the Jews have no right as the people of God. That is a major turnaround by any standard that one might want to employ.
That's the influence of the bacon.
That's right, exactly. And the claim that we know how to eat, right? I mean, this anti-Semitism of the Romans about bacon It goes all the way back to Cicero. But by the 4th century, you can start to make it law. You can make it a requirement. So that the tradition of argument within Haggadah, Haggadah is being used as part of the argument overall. And what's vital to understand, whenever you encounter a telling, a Haggadah, is what is the purpose of the telling? What is its aim? Because it will only rarely be in the position of having an aim like ours, an aim to give historical information. Sometimes it will do so. Sometimes it will do so like a witness in court, despite itself. Sometimes you can know where it's coming from by its voice. Sometimes you can't. Some people don't know I was born in the same county as Donald Trump.
I could tell.
Yet that is true. Well, that's because I told you in advance. That is to say that sometimes the packaging of the language will tell us everything. Sometimes it's only one element. Whenever you try to rely on just a single standard in trying to date this material, the results are probably going to be distortion.
What about the manuscripts that we have of these documents? I mean, it's one thing to talk about the language and maybe the different dialects, but what about the manuscripts? What kind of manuscripts, Dr. Evans, do we have of these documents we've been talking about, these important documents?
Well, it's a great variety of manuscripts. Thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually have, I think the Leviticus scroll that we have in one of the caves is the oldest one, is 300 BC. But if the Great Isaiah Scroll is a wonderful one to talk about. It dates somewhere around 150 to 200 BC. And so it's pointed out you go from, say, Codex Leningrad, which dates around 100 or 1008 AD or CE. And so we jump back in time 1100 centuries. Now that's quite a jump. And so textual critics are fascinated, and there it is. It is essentially the same text, so there is a stability, same number of chapters, same number of verses, and so on. And so we have some spectacular examples like that. I think of as we typically count the books in the Old Testament, 39 books. We have 37 or 38. Esther is the only one clearly not represented. And some of it is small fragments, but we have multiple copies of most of the books that make up Torah, many copies of the Psalter, many copies of some of the prophets like Isaiah. With New Testament manuscripts, again, the record is enormous. I finished a book recently, and I was making some comparisons, and I was talking about classical literature, and classicists, they don't understand us New Testament people because we have an embarrassment of riches and don't seem happy with it. The classicists, they're working, you're working on Tacitus, whose name has come up, or you're working on someone else, a classical author, and you have 6 or 7 manuscripts. And in some cases, you don't even have the entire work. You have 3/4 of whatever he wrote. You have a handful of manuscripts. And the best manuscript you have is 900 years after the original was written. A huge gap. So there's nothing like that in the New Testament. So anyway, manuscripts are very important, and one of the big changes, David, as I'm sure you know, is just in the last generation there's been a great increase of interest in the artifacts, the manuscript artifacts themselves. And I think that's an enormous, very important development. And so we're fascinated with this old copy of this or that.
When I was in the University of Manchester, I was at John Ryland's library, and they brought out a little fragment of John's Gospel called P52. And I got a chance to see this. The earliest fragment of any New Testament book, Gospel of John. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. And it's just beautiful honey-colored papyrus. It's not aged, gotten dark with the ages, but it's a beautiful piece. And then they also said to me while I was there, I was researching some things in early Christian literature and liturgy. And they said, we have boxes of material that we don't know what to do with. Could you please come back? Just manuscripts, texts. Sometimes they're you know, the thumbnail size, there's not much to them, but other times very significant. So we need scholars. There may be scholars sitting out there ready to go to the University of Manchester, maybe to Oxford and Oxyrhynchus collection to go out there and to help us with all of that. But there is an embarrassment of riches.
I can add something to that, David.
Please.
Just exactly your example. He's talking about P52. It's a fragment of John 18. We think it dates first half, 2nd century, which does make it very early. But the Novum Testamentum journal, the newest issue just came out. I picked up my copy yesterday. Flipped it open, and papyrologists have reported that they have identified 4 fragments of P75. P75, I'm of the opinion that there was a two codex collection of all 4 Gospels, and the one that survives that I'm talking about is contains Luke and John. And so the Bodmer, having some financial difficulties, sold P75 to a wealthy person who donated it to the Vatican. And so when we did our documentary Fragments of Truth a couple of years ago, we had to see P75 at the Vatican. Well, Brent Nongbree and another scholar was sorting through unidentified fragments that were still in Geneva, Switzerland at the Bodmer, where P75 used to live, where P66, the Gospel of John, still is there. And they found some fragments, and guess what? They match with P75. So these kinds of things happen. And by the way, it impacts about 6 or 7 verses in mostly Luke, but also 1 or 2 lines in John. This kind of thing still happens. And so when David says there are box loads of unidentified fragments, there will be more discoveries yet to come. I'll comment on Mark if you want, the Mark fragment. Did you want me to say anything about Mark?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because a few years ago there was a big sort of hullabaloo. Was that a good kerfuffle? What was it? I don't know.
I think that's too
maybe
mild.
An early fragment from Mark's Gospel, which is probably the first Gospel written.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a scandal. It's not finished. It's still unfolding, but we've been getting updates in recent months. There was a special meeting at the Society of Biblical Literature in November in San Diego to discuss it further. Still sorting it out, but it is quite a scandal. A fragment, and when I say fragment, a piece of papyrus about that size, front side, back side, so it was a leaf inside of a codex. And anyway, it was identified or dated as late 1st century, perhaps early 2nd century by R.A. Coles, Revel Coles, a papyrologist at Oxford, but he didn't realize it was Mark. He sees this fragment, he goes, oh, it looks late 1st, early 2nd century, and he puts a little card with it to that effect. And then another papyrologist, I'm not going to mention his name because there are some legal issues now, but anyway, he looked at it, and yes, it does look like it's late 1st century. In fact, he was a little more definitive. It might be only late 1st century. Forget about saying 2nd century, and he even suggested it probably shouldn't date any later than the 80s. And Shazam, he realized it's Mark chapter 1. And if that date had stood up, it would beat P52. It's since been published as Papyrus 137, I think. Yeah, P137. By the way, when I was in seminary, there were only half as many papyri. And I'm not hundreds of years old. Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing.
It's doubled the number.
There's so much in terms of just the physical manuscripts themselves. There's a beauty to it. There's the historicity involved into it. Rabbi Shulam, I know you want to comment.
I sent a short article to the Panelist through Charles.
Right.
But I just want to share with you one example of the importance of this Jewish material. I'm reading now in English a text that was written in Hebrew originally.
Go ahead in Hebrew. We can get
And,
that. We'll get that, right?
No, I don't want to spend the time because I want to get to the point. Rabbi Nachman and Rabbi Isaac have heard when Bar Naphle will come. The bar means son, Naphle means it's a Greek idiom that is used by the Aramaic language as well, means the clouds. The son of the clouds. Who is the son of the clouds? It's taken from Daniel 1, coming down from the clouds. So they were discussing, when is this Bar Naphle, the son of the clouds, coming? And now they want to also discuss who is this character from the Daniel that is coming down from heaven in the clouds. So they ask, who is this Bar Naphle? The Messiah, he answered. In other words, Rabbi Nachman answers, is the Messiah. That within itself is a huge bomb in the Jewish world. Why? Because identifying the text of Daniel, of the one coming down from heaven, as Baranash, the son of man, the son of the cloud in this text, coming down in the clouds, is the Messiah, is already a very, very important polemic point. The Jewish rabbis in the late 2nd century are now identifying that this text in Daniel is a messianic text. So he's the Messiah, he answered. Do you call Messiah Bar Naphle? Rabbi Isaac answers. Rabbi Nachman says, do you dare, in other words, do you dare to identify this character that is described in Daniel as the Messiah? Even so, he rejoined, he replied, as it is written, in that day I will rise up the tabernacle of David, Sukkot David Hanofelet, the collapsed tabernacle of David. This is the text that Yaakov, in English you call him James because the king wanted his name in the Bible. But in all the other languages it's Yaakov, or Saint Jack, or Santiago in Spanish, or whatever. So Yaakov answers, Rabbi Yaakov answers, he says, even so, it is written, in that day I will raise up the fallen tabernacle of David. That is, in Hebrew, fallen means anofelet, the same root as the naphle in Aramaic and in Greek. Now I'm just reading you a very small section of this thing that I wrote a long time ago. The rabbis are dealing with the same text that the apostles in Acts 15 are dealing from Amos chapter 9. Yep. And they are attributing that same text as a messianic text. This is of extreme importance. It's a treasure for those of us who preach the gospel to the Jewish people. Because here we have these late 2nd century rabbis who are dealing with the same text, identifying that text with the Messiah, connecting that text with the text in Daniel, which is a messianic text, and it ties up the story from within the Jewish context, from the rabbinical material. So it's very, very important. For example, Dr. Chilton brought in the text about that Jesus was a bastard. Okay? Let me tell you a short story that happened a few years, about 4 years ago in our congregation. 10 years we fought to get a building license for our building downtown Jerusalem. Finally, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court approved it, and we got the license, and we built the building. The rabbi that was fighting us was the chief rabbi of the neighborhood, which is the elite neighborhood of Jerusalem, downtown Jerusalem residential area, where all the judges and all the professors live in that area, Rechavia. He calls the office and he says, I want to talk to your priest, the priest of your church. Our secretary says, we don't have a church and we don't have a priest. So he says, I want to talk to Joseph Shulam. Okay. Come to the office. He says, no, I don't want to come to the office. I want to come to your church. We don't have a church. We have a synagogue. For me, it's a church. All right, we made the appointment. So you, that the young man that's now the leader, together with Daniel of our ministry and our congregation, and I and my wife went down waiting for the rabbi to come. Our windows were open. We're seeing the street, so the rabbis walked by the entrance, and he walked back, and he walked back several times to make sure that nobody sees him coming into the building. And he walks in. He's a rabbi that was raised in the Bronx in New York, together with 4 other very, very famous people. From the kindergarten days, he was together with Michael Milken and Boyski and Baruch Madov and Rabbi Daniel Tropper. The 4 of them were raised from kindergarten all the way to Yeshiva University in New York, years and years buddies and friends. 3 of them were arch crooks, and Rabbi Tropper and him, great rabbis. Wonderful, sincere, godly people. So 2 out of 5 is okay.
That's batting 400, right? That's
So
Hall of Fame stuff, right?
So he comes in and he looks around and says, where is the cross? We said, we don't have a cross. He says, but you're Christians. I said, well, we're disciples of Jesus. The word Christian, how many times does the word Christian exist in the New Testament?
As such, only once. Although, Michael has a point in the sense that in the first letter of Peter, you have the statement, if you're persecuted on account of the name of Christ, there's probably a reflection that the
So it's
name
already
is
more
about.
than once.
We'll call that 1.5.
1.5.
It's actually, you see, that's the problem with the Christians. They don't even know how many times the word Christian exists in the New Testament. It actually exists 3 times.
We know now.
Now you
Now
know.
that you've told us, 1.5.
3 times.
3 times.
Acts 11:26, Acts 26, when Agrippa says to Paul, you almost convinced
are
me
you
to be a
making me a
Christian.
Christian?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And 1 Peter 4:16. But back,
That's the half.
so so back to this story. So he says we don't have a cross. He says, I see you have a Torah cabinet. I said, we do. Do you have a Torah scroll? And he says, let me open it. So Yudah opens it up, and he sees 5 scrolls. He says, you have 5 Torah scrolls? I said, no, we only have 4 Torah scrolls and a scroll from the prophets for reading on Shabbat. He says, where did you get it? I said, we bought it. Where did you buy it? We bought it in Ma'asharim, the Orthodox neighborhood. So he says, I want to come and teach in your congregation. So come on Wednesday, we'll have a Bible study. You can teach. What do you want to teach? I want to teach the first tractate of the Mishnah, the sayings of the fathers, Pirkei Avot. Oh, welcome, okay. So he comes, and he opens the book, and he doesn't finish the first sentence, and he stops cold, and he puts his hand like that, and leans on the pulpit, and maybe for a minute or 2 minutes he's silent, and I see that his face is getting redder and redder and redder and redder, and I tell the men in our congregation, some of them are hot-blooded, you shut up. If he says anything negative, let the women answer. Now, among the women, we have Daniel Stern's mother. And so he says, did you know that Jesus was a bastard? based on that text from Toldot Yeshu. And our women just jump up and say, how dare you come into our house of worship and say this? Did you know? And they start quoting to him from the Talmud and from the Midrash, and they tear his argument apart completely. And they don't let him say a word to the end of the class. Filibuster him. So at the end of the class, I dismiss the class, and he comes and says to me in front of the women, he says, how come your women know so much about the Talmud? Don't you know that it's forbidden to teach women Talmud? Who taught them? I said, I taught them. But why did you teach them? To answer people like you. So he says, I loved it. I want to come back next week again. I said, you can come back next week if you then don't dare to say one negative word about Yeshua, about Jesus. If you stick to your text, you can come and teach again. So the next Wednesday he comes and he teaches from the same tractate, the next text. And he's a very famous statement of one of very famous early rabbis from before Jesus rabbis. And he says, the world depends on three things: on work, on charity, and on the study of the Torah. And so one woman who's from our congregation, a disciple that I brought to the Lord years ago, who has a master's degree from Cambridge University in England, she raises her hand and says, what do you mean work? He says, work, it means worship. She says, no, work means work. Why don't you Orthodox guys work to earn your money? You depend on charity of the government. You're mooching off the government. He said, no, it means worship. She said, no, I can now. She quotes from other commentaries. It means work means work. So he continues reading, and he comes to a statement in the same chapter, chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot, don't talk to the women too much. Anyway, the long story of it is that in the end, in the fourth time he came to teach, he said, I want us to pray together the evening Jewish prayer from the Jewish Siddur. I told him, do you know what it means? It means, according to the halacha, it means that you accept us as kosher Jews, even though we believe in Yeshua. He says, I do. I do accept you as kosher Jews. And I do want to pray with you. So the next Wednesday he comes and he says, okay, let's pray. I said, you are the rabbi, you read. You lead the prayer. He said, no, you are the rabbi here, you lead the prayer. I said, I can read it, but I can't sing it because I can't carry a tune in a bucket. And he said, okay, go ahead. So I read it, and he prayed, and he said amen, and he continued to teach. And this is the power, folks, of restoring the New Testament church back to its Jewish origins, back to its Jewish culture. And that's why this teaser, this whole thing is a teaser for you to start respecting the Jewishness of the gospel. Yeah? There's no Santa Claus in the gospel. There's no Rudolph and Prancer and Dancer, and the reindeer are not made in Israel. Maybe made in Finland, but not in Israel. So that's the teaser of this whole exercise this weekend. Tomorrow, I will show you three rabbis. There's more, but three very, very important rabbis, Talmudic rabbis, Mishnaic rabbis, that became disciples of Jesus. One of them is mentioned in the New Testament very clearly, but most Christians don't know him because they have been trained to look at the New Testament as a Jewish book. And when you start looking at the New Testament within its context, first century context, not the Greco-Roman context, which is Jesus fought against it and the apostles fought against the Hellenization of the gospel and of the New Testament. So that's the object of tomorrow. I will share with you about 3 rabbis, but today, do we have these two pictures that I have? Can we flash them on the board?
I don't know that we have those. No, that didn't work out.
Tomorrow
let me
we'll
ask
try.
Michael Val, because I want to follow up
Tomorrow
on what
we'll try.
you were saying a moment ago about the reception that you've gotten there. Michael, in Sugar Land, where your congregation is, what kind of reception have you gotten from other rabbis who are not Messianic rabbis, and maybe Protestant or Catholic churches?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's been fun following this conversation. We have been on a ride. This is fantastic. Ours has been really good. First and foremost, we try to be very clear about who we are. We are Jews who follow Yeshua. We do our best to live out a Jewish life, Jewish culture, and embed it within our synagogue and within our community. And being just forthright with it, we've had a great reception. We do funerals together with other rabbis, which Joseph Shulam will tell you, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Most of the time, in the past, we've been told we can't even be there, but now we do funerals together, we participate in events together, and I try to come to the table with just a deep sense of how can we respect one another in these conversations. And I think that's where, when I was initially reading over what Joseph sent out about the rabbis and rabbinic thought, initially I thought to myself, well, I've read Craig Evans' works, I've read some of Dr. Chilton, and I feel like in the academic community, there's such a wide acceptance to say, yeah, let's talk about what's going on within Talmudic literature, within Mishnaic literature, because it's helpful for us to understand. And so, living in that world, you kind of feel like, yeah, it seems like everybody accepts it. But then I was thinking back a few years ago about a book, I don't know if many of you remember it, it was called Pray in Circles. And it was a Christian pastor in Washington. And he picked up one of the stories in the Talmud about Honi, the circle drawer. And this guy drew a circle, prayed, asked God to rain. It didn't rain. He prayed harder, and eventually it did rain. So this pastor wrote a book, real simple, and said, hey, listen, draw circles around things you need to pray for and pray really hard. Okay, it's kind of goofy, but I get it, right? He's just emphasizing prayer. And I thought, well, that's neat, and it was one of these bestseller kind of Christian books, unlike the books that we probably really need published, like Syriac books. This had a lot of circulation. And I thought, well, everybody loved it. But then I went and looked at some of the real popular bloggers that are represented by evangelicalism. And one of them, if I can just say this, his response was, don't read this book, and I have it printed out here. He said it's unbiblical because it comes from a Talmudic story. It's extra biblical, and you shouldn't be reading there. And it's anti-biblical. You don't draw circles around things that you're praying for. And I think when I read that, and after I initially read Joseph Shulam's paper, which I think is fantastic, and what I like about Joseph is you will get a knee-jerk reaction. He does come to bring a little bit of chaos, which I do love. But in a real sense, I think in the academic community, most people are saying, yeah, let's read, let's embrace, and let's try to understand better the context. But then I think at a popular level, I'm not sure that message always gets clearly communicated. And sometimes the tendency is a real biblical fundamentalism. It doesn't help unless you just read it from here. Now, I'm not trying to tell everybody in this room, go draw circles around your problems and pray. But if you do that, mazel tov, have a good time. But I think there's things that we can benefit, like Joseph is going to talk about, and definitely what Dr. Chilton talked about from the Toledot. For me, understanding that there was a discussion, a prolonged discussion, all the way into the Middle Ages about the death and resurrection of Yeshua, and it's being passed on. That's important to me, to understand how it was passed on, where it was passed on, whether it's in a negative or positive sense, and then to try to enter into that conversation and understand it. And I think that approach has helped me within my own context of ministry.
Okay, yeah. Dr. Chilton.
Yeah, if I may just follow on from that, it's interesting that in the midst of strife, and clearly the study of Haggadot is to some extent the study of strife, of argument and counter-argument, there are nonetheless very important resonances. For example, this citation of the book of Amos that Joseph has referred to gives us the sense of a messianic reading of Amos, which one might have thought just from Amos itself was possible, but here we see it endorsed. We see it used in a different way in Acts 15 when it's cited by Yaakov, the brother of Jesus, and earlier at Qumran. There are two cases there where it's used in a clearly messianic sense, that is, the restoration of David is part of a common aspiration. And the commonality of aspiration is, I think, one of the ways in which a religion can discover its depth.
Yeah, that's right.
That is, by understanding the emotional resonance of expecting that David will be reasserted. Even in those cases where the way you believe that's happening is distinctive, permits you to share the same common ground. Appreciating difference is sometimes of the greatest help in discovering commonality.
Yeah, that's right.
True.
Wise words. The reality is, and we're coming down to kind of our last couple of minutes, but the reality is we're kind of living in a time when we see in Europe and in North America a rising tide of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Is there anything in this conversation that could help us address that in our congregations, in our churches?
Yes.
Joseph, we'll start with you. And I'd love to hear from each of you briefly on that one question, because I think it's a true threat.
The founder of the Hasidic movement about 370 years ago, his name is called the Baal Shem Tov. Told many stories. There is a book about the stories that Baal Shem Tov told. There is one story that he tells about one Saturday evening. He lived in Poland, of today's Poland. And one Saturday evening in the spring, after he had eaten lunch and rested in the afternoon, and his evening time it's cooler, and he's taking a walk out in the Polish countryside. And in the Polish countryside, like in a lot of the Catholic countries, they have like roadside shrines. They're in Greece and Eastern Europe has them, and they have a pillar, and on top of it they have like a little building like a church, and inside there is a picture, an icon of Jesus and Mary, and some oil and a candle, and you can light a candle there in that little shrine. So he passes by one of these shrines and he hears somebody crying. And he looks around. He doesn't see anybody. Oh, he continues. He says, maybe, who knows, whatever. He continues on his walk. On his walk back, he comes by the same shrine. He hears the same cry. A person crying. He says, well, that's not possible. So he starts looking around and he sees behind that shrine a Jew sitting there, tattered clothes, dirty, unkempt, like a poor person, like a homeless person sitting there crying. He says, brother, what are you crying about? He says, I'm crying because my disciples are persecuting and killing my brothers. That's the end of the story of the Baal Shem Tov there. And it's really, we're talking about 370 years ago, a long time ago, in Europe. It's really a story that actually greatly influenced my life. And when Christians realize that, that every anti-Semitic act, every anti-Semitic statement is actually not against the Jews, it's against the King of the Jews, right. The world representative of the Jews, they should wake up. And Jews shouldn't fight anti-Semitism. The Christian's job is to fight anti-Semitism more than the Jews.
That's right, yes.
Dr. Evans?
Yeah, I've noticed that in the last 30 years, or since childhood. When I was in grade school, we saw the Nazi films, from the Holocaust. I don't think they do that anymore. I'm not sure. My impression is that's changed. I've noticed in my own students over the years, I'm in my 40th year, by the way, of full-time academic life. And students, there's a steep decline in the knowledge of history.
Yeah.
They can't give you the dates of World War II. I'm not real sure who participated or even why. So I think that's part of it. If the history is gone, the actual facts, then it's difficult to impress, I think, upon some of these young lives, these things that are going on. Ignorant people are easier to manipulate. If they don't know any history, they can be lied to. So I think that's part of it. Education is very important, but attitudes, my goodness, there's no room for any kind of racism or anti-Semitism in the church, for crying out loud. Has anybody read Galatians 3:28? Anybody take seriously New Testament teaching about the unity and the fellowship that we have? So I think that's a very important point to emphasize.
Michael?
Can I tell two stories? I got my own. I got it.
Yeah, sure.
Number one, when we moved back down here from Canada, that's God's country. Thank you. We moved in, and 2 doors down from us was a white supremacist. And when he saw that I wore a kippah, the next day he put up his, general flag, the Southern Pride flag, and a few weeks later put up placards for recruitment for the local Nazi party, and very antagonistic and hostile towards us. And like many Jewish people, I told my children, we are not afraid, but nor are we stupid. We will be wise. And you guys remember Hurricane Harvey when that took place. I was sitting in my garage, and we're watching the rain fall, and he was walking back and forth on the street. And so I invited him to come in my garage, and my wife very wisely said, "Michael, you're an idiot. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, let's see if we can make a friend out of an enemy." So he came into my garage, we sat down, we had a brief conversation, and when he found out that I believed in Yeshua, Jesus, he said, "Oh, okay, you're different than the other Jews." We talked, I prayed with him, he went home, and then a few weeks later he drove to Florida and opened up fire on a rally there. His name is Tyler Tinbrick. He's now sitting in prison on a group of African American and Jewish protesters. I tell you that story to tell you how real it is, how close it is, how next door the problem of anti-Semitism really is. And I agree with Joseph. It's the job of Christians to fight anti-Semitism, but it's my job to lead by example too. So a few weeks ago, I went and had lunch with a local imam in our area, known to be a little bit radical, but I went because I do deeply believe that if I can sit down at the table with you, look you in your eyes, talk to you, you hear my voice and I can hear your voice, somehow we can stop thinking that we're enemies and learn how to become friends. Now, when I told one of my good friends who I run with that I went and had lunch over at this certain mosque with this certain imam, she's a Muslim, and she looked at me and she said, "They don't let Jews in there." I said, "Well, they let this Jew in there." And I got an invitation to come back because somehow I still do deeply believe that one of Yeshua's greatest teachings about love, that's how the world would know us. So I want you to know why I want Christians to fight anti-Semitism. I want you to know that I'm also leading by example as a Jewish follower of Yeshua to heal breaches in the Muslim community, because I think that also can help to bring an end to some of the violence.
Very good. Well said. Thank you. Bruce, final thoughts?
Yes, I just want to focus on what your neighbor said to you. You are different than the other Jews. What does that reflect? It reflects defining everything that's related to Judaism as the negation of Christianity. It goes back to this 4th century shift that I referred to earlier, where you take the opposition to a certain group of people as being a positive statement of your own value. Anyone can see on reflection that is something worse than a fallacy in logic, but in terms of the gospel, it's a travesty. Yeah. And that is the reason for which I think that anti-Semitism lies at the root not only of the problem of Christianity, but of its solution, in the sense that if Christianity can address anti-Semitism, it can deal with all other forms of fallacious travesty that turn the other into the root of all difficulty.
Very good. Would you thank our panelists today?